I'm Carol Fitzgerald from readinggroupguides.com, a website from the Book Report Network, and the host of the Book Reporter Talks to Video podcast series. And I want to welcome you to our fourth Bookaccino Live Book Group event, where our guest this evening is Robert Kolker, the author of the New York Times bestseller, Hidden Valley Road, Inside the Mind of an American Family. I first heard about this book in December 2019 at a library event, preview event that Random House was doing. When I heard him speak about it, it was a book I immediately wanted to read. I was fascinated by the story of the Galvin family, which has 12 children, 10 of them boys, and 6 of those boys have schizophrenia. Hidden Valley Road is an Oprah Book Club selection, as well as one of my book reporter bets on selections when it came out last year. So let me talk to you about the format for tonight. It's going to be as follows. Let me start by saying that I'm assuming that everybody has read the book. This is the kind of book club we're assuming. So if we talk spoilers or we give anything away, just know that we're just assuming that everybody has already read. I will begin a discussion with Bob, and then 3 members of our audience will be joining us live to share their questions. And I'm going to share some questions that readers have written in that didn't want to be on screen as well. And then we're going to go to audience Q&A. So please drop your questions into the chat below. So with no further ado, let's welcome Bob to our virtual stage.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, how are you, Bob? Good to see you.
I'm just fine. Nice to see you too, Carol. I want to thank you for thinking of the book for this series and for including me in this and for so many other things. The book came out, as you know, a little more than a year ago, and you were right. You were first in line to support it and to bring attention to it and to interview me. And every interaction with you has just been so delightful. I'm just really grateful.
Oh, I so enjoyed this book. I so enjoyed talking to you. It's like we've had this virtual relationship. It's like we've now had 2 interviews virtually. We've never met, but you think we're like BFFs by the time we get done with this, because we've had these really in-depth conversations. You know, let's start out with some basics. For many of that don't know, how did you come to meet the Galvin family, and what's the start for this story?
I really came to this entire book as a narrative journalist, not as a doctor, not as a science journalist or science writer, and not as a patient or as someone with severe mental illness in my family, but as someone who had built a career writing magazine articles and one other book, telling nonfiction stories about everyday people caught up in really very difficult and emotionally challenging moments. And so a mutual friend of mine in the Galvins put us together because he thought that we would be a good match because of my background, not in the science of schizophrenia, but in my background writing about people who might otherwise, shy away from attention, who really never thought that they would one day be in the spotlight, but who have been through something extraordinary and really the world could benefit from learning about what they went through. I met the sisters first over the phone, and then I took it very slowly, getting to know the family so that everyone would feel confident speaking with me for a book. And so that even though I would be an impartial journalist writing their story, I didn't want to start a war in the family and just announce that I was writing a book and then have one brother stand up and say, this is ridiculous. So it took a whole year of meeting and speaking with everyone to make sure that everyone felt comfortable talking about everything that happened to their family. And everyone answered every question. It was really quite stunning. Everyone was ready to have the story told. There was a sense almost like it was now or never, because their mother, Mimi, was 90 years old. So they really went for it.
Yeah, and they just said they were going to do it. Did you know, like when you first sat down with the sisters, did you say, whoa, this is something I want to write about? Was the energy there right then and say, or were you saying, okay, let's see how I'm going to approach this?
I have to admit that if anything, they were enthusiastic and I was at arm's length. I was skeptical. My first reaction was, this is one of the saddest things I've ever heard, because they really told me everything in that first phone call. They talked about their own abuse at the hands of their older brother, and they talked about clergy abuse, and they talked about the murder-suicide, and of course about the repeated hospitalizations and the police coming to the house. And they spoke about their parents as being somewhat in denial about the illness at first. It really was a lot, and I wondered, well, what is this really about? I mean, is this, if I were to write about the family, would it be about two sisters surviving a difficult childhood? Would it be a science book where they were just a case study and I'd be writing about one of their doctors? And but they also made it clear that they felt as if their family was scientifically significant, but that they didn't really, they needed the help of a reporter to really go in and really figure out exactly what that meant and catch up with the research. So it was a heavy lift, and I didn't know how, I didn't know whether the rest of the family was really on board. So I came up with the strategy. I said, let's take it slow. And once a week, I'll get on the phone for an hour or so with a different member of your family, starting with your mother and all of your brothers, and then perhaps with some of the doctors who have treated the family over the years. And I'd be open very casually, and I'd say, you know, your sisters are interested in a book about your family. How does that make you feel? And what do you think about when you think about the idea of a book? And we would all know one way or another in a few months whether it was going to be feasible to really even do this, or whether somebody would stand up and say, no, this is my private information and I don't want a book about this. And that gave me time, by the way, to be a journalist and to check it out, you know, to check the story, to call up authorities in schizophrenia and say, have you heard of this family? Do you know anything about them? If such a family existed, would it be interesting to you? Again, because it really was building the entire thing from the ground up. It's not like they were in the newspapers or anything like that.
So now you're at this point, do you have when do you get a book deal? Like, when you're not at that point, you're really
Yeah,
just spending months researching, figuring out if you have the story. It's not like, oh, you've got a deal and you're writing the book at this point, correct?
that's correct. I talked to them in February or March of 2016. And by the end of the summer, I was very, very enthusiastic. I had come full circle. I was no longer that skeptical person from that first phone call. And when I thought about the book, I thought, maybe I don't have to decide whether the book is a science book or a family story or a story of the sisters or a story of the doctors. What if it's about everything? What if this is a really big book? And as I looked at a lot of the other books out there, I said to myself, there are a lot of wonderful memoirs about mental illness, a lot of first-person books about people's own struggles or the struggles of their loved ones. But I had never seen a third-person book before where you get a 360-degree view of the family with everybody's point of view stitched together. It seemed unique to me, and that got me even more excited. I thought it could be a special book that way, that even if it wasn't successful, it'd be worth pursuing. So I got very excited, and I visited Colorado and got to know them better and put together a book proposal, and didn't sell the book proposal until June of the following year. So it was more than a year after that first phone call with the Galvins. But the advantage of that was that I was able to write in a book proposal. I've spent the last year getting to know this family and researching the family, and that was able to build up a tremendous amount of enthusiasm from the publishers who read the proposal. I took a lot of meetings and had a lot of confidence in those meetings, because I felt like I wasn't taking a flyer on this. I felt like I knew what I wanted to accomplish because I had done so much advance work. And the publishers responded. Everybody was very enthusiastic, and that was really great. And then once, of course, I got the book deal, then I quit my job because I knew that it would be such a tall order to write the book. I was an investigative reporter for Bloomberg News, and I knew that this was not a book I could do in 6 weeks or 6 months. It was going to take a couple of years, and it needed to be full time. And I needed to study schizophrenia and what it was and what our understanding of it and how it has changed over time. So, thankfully the publisher came through and with enough to allow me to work on this full time for a couple of years. And that was really wonderful, really wonderful.
So when you're working on full time, are you going out and you're doing interviews and then writing, or are you doing research and then writing? I take it you have an outline, or you have a path of where you think you're going, or did you have a path of where? And even the way the chapters are broken down, where it's each family member, did you know that up front, like that, how you were going to be doing this?
I knew that there would be at least two parts to the book, and that one part would be the older generation, would be the parents meeting and raising a family and living that American dream, and then things becoming difficult and mysterious and then tragic. and that I knew that part one would end at the most terrible bottom for the family hitting bottom. So in my mind, that was probably around the time of the murder suicide, or maybe shortly after that, when Margaret, the older sister, gets airlifted out of the family and taken away to live somewhere else, leaving the other sister behind. I thought that might be that just felt like the right time for the curtain to come down on act one. And then act two, or part two, or the second part of the book, would be the younger generation growing up and reevaluating everything that happened in their lives, and trying to understand their parents' decisions and trying to find new ways to relate to one another. It would be about the sisters trying to escape the family and then slowly finding ways back into to have relationships again. And it would be about the science. It would be about the researchers showing up on the scene and starting to study the family. That's what I knew going in. But the rest of it was wide open, like how much science would be in it. Would the science be separate chapters or not? Would the researchers be their own characters, or are there too many characters in the book already? How much would I find in the way of old medical records for the family? Would I really have hard information about what happened to these brothers, or would it be kind of mysterious because it was so long ago and records get destroyed? So I had a plan, but I didn't have the details. And so I just pressed hard on the details. And I started to keep two big outlines: a science outline about the story of the science of schizophrenia, and the family story outline. And just to make sure that everything was in chronological order, because these are fuzzy memories for people. There's one example I give actually about this. There's one very vivid scene in the book that takes place in Thanksgiving in 1972, where there's a fight and the Thanksgiving table gets destroyed, and Mimi, the mother, eventually destroys a gingerbread house out of frustration. Several people in the family remember this very vividly, but nobody knew for sure exactly what year it was, because it's 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And Thanksgivings happen every year, and they never had a biographer knock on their door to ask them for names and dates on when things happened. And so that was the sort of work I was doing. I was going through records and diaries and using process of elimination and saying, well, John had just gotten married and he went to his in-laws' place one year. That was 1971, but he was here for this, so it couldn't be 1971. Or Donald was in the hospital and he wasn't given leave. I had his records finally, and so he didn't have leave to come home one year, so it couldn't have been that year. And so I eventually arrived at 1972. There was a lot of that, a lot of stitching together things almost like a quilt.
And it's funny, I would have thought that part one would have been when the table got upended. That's what
Yeah.
I thought that you were going to say, that was the end of part one, because it was this realization of, okay, what is really going on in this house? Because it's such a dramatic scene. And it's kind of thing where if you were a playwright, you'd write that scene in and say, oh, this is what's happening. It's like, no, but this was real life. This is what these people were actually going through. And I just found that you're being able to take these very real situations and bring them to us and say, this is kind of horrific of what's going on, but how the family reacts, how each person reacts in between.
The reactions were really key, I have to say, because there's so much violence and so much hardship that the family faces. And I didn't want the book to be solely about the bad stuff, because then it becomes an exercise in sensationalism or in rubbernecking, or like, look at this car crash. Instead, I wanted to acknowledge every single bad thing that happened, but I wanted to talk about everything that happened before and everything that happened after, just so that people understood that this wasn't the only story. There are other ways of that the lives have longer reach than just those moments.
Well, I would have to say that the guide inside of who was who, the years they were born, and all that was so helpful to me, because I kept clicking back, because after the first murder suicide, I'm like, okay, who's dying next? And I was looking like, who's still alive at the end of this book? Because you had this feeling that this whole thing could implode really quickly. Like, who's going to be left at the end? And so I found that directory at the beginning so helpful. Was that always something you planned to have there, or was that like during the editing process, let's add it in?
No, I had a couple thoughts about that. The first was that the story was going to be tangled and complicated enough. Excuse me, I'm going to turn this phone off. The story was going to be tangled and complicated and messy enough without without leaving people guessing too much about too many surprises. And so why not let people know that people eventually get married or people become deceased early on, so at least they have something to hold on to. And the other thing is, in my previous book, Lost Girls, there were many people in that book as well. And I waited till the end of the book to run a cast of characters, or to run a list of the people in the book. And everyone, including my mother, complained and said, I had no idea that list existed, and it really needed to be at the beginning of the book, and it would have been much more helpful. So I kept that in mind for this book as well.
Well, it's really funny. I remember when we were first looking at the book, and it's up on a slide, and they're talking about the 10 people and the 12 children, and I'm counting, and I'm trying to figure out. I go, "Where's the last one?" I go, "Oh, the mother's pregnant. Oh, that's where it is." So the entire time, I want you to know that Bob is speaking. I'm counting, like this slide that's up there, going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm looking. My gosh, there's a child on every step, and they completely line up. And that intrigued me right from the beginning. I mean, I knew large families, but not a large family like that.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, the first time I saw that photograph was pretty early on, and that took me a really long way toward being enthusiastic about making it a book. Like, one look at that picture and I was like, oh, I get it. This is a book. This is a real big story to tell.
Yeah, it's a big story, and you're going to come at it from so many different angles, because it has every kind of intrigue that could be happily going on, including what's going to be the medical science behind this. What can they do for these people? Can they help or can't they help? I'm going to bring Michelle on, because she's got a good question about your objectivity in telling the story and what happened there. So Michelle, take it away.
Great. Hi, Bob.
Hi.
I had so many questions, and I've narrowed it down to two. The first being, how were you able to stay so objective in telling the story, especially after having met all of the family members, perhaps the parents especially? Was that difficult?
That was one area that I wasn't as challenged about as I was for others, because I have been a journalist for 25 years, and I've sort of come at it at a certain approach. And it's an approach that worked out pretty well with my first book as well, which is that I try to write as sensitively and intimately and dramatically and vividly as possible about the people I'm writing about, but I do my best not to cross over into advocacy. And there are a lot of really terrific nonfiction books out there that are basically advocacy journalism, that are sort of picking up the torch for whoever they're writing about and saying, who will help these people? I'm on their side. But that's not me. That's not where I go. Because I'm convinced that that doing it the way that I do it makes for a book that's more persuasive to readers, that helps readers have more confidence in the book, so that when they're reading the book, they aren't thinking they're getting a prosecutor making a case or a defense attorney making a case on behalf of people. They feel like they're getting a more well-rounded viewpoint, and so everything feels more authentic or believable. So I have that in mind the entire time. But I have no problem saying that to everyone I write about, that my approach is humane, that it's tasteful, that it's mature, that it's not exploitative, that I'm not interested in gotcha journalism, that I'm not going to treat them like I'm reporting on a mayor or a governor or the president, like trying to catch them in some kind of double standard or inconsistency and then go, aha, and that I'm not the judge or jury. And I say that a lot all the time to the people I write about. Like, I'm there to help readers understand what it's like to be you and to channel your experience as authentically as I can, but people's experiences as well.
That makes sense. So that kind of brought my next question was, was that difficult to sit down and ask all those difficult questions with all the members of the family as you started to establish relationships with them? You were so compassionate yet objective. It just seems like not all authors can balance that out, and you did a great job in doing that. Was that because of your experience as well that you think you could do that?
Yeah, although even with that experience, I think I was putting off the tougher questions till later. Like I didn't come out guns blazing, sitting down to say, let's talk about the time that you were sexually abused. I sort of tried to make it more organic than that, and to talk about everything else and see where it bubbles up. And then the second or third time I would circle back to Lindsay or to Margaret or to anyone else, I would say, we talked about everything except this obviously difficult thing. And so we ought to set aside a little bit of time to talk about that so that they're ready to talk about that. I will say in all candor that this family was extraordinarily open and ready to discuss basically everything. Honestly, I can't remember a time where I asked anyone a question and they said, "I'm sorry, but I refuse to speak about this for the book." I think that, and I wasn't expecting that, but I think I should have, maybe because, first of all, the real tough stuff happened in the 1970s, which was a long time ago. So people were ready. And then secondly, the sisters really wanted the book to happen. And so everybody else was sort of deferring to the sisters because they had been through so much of the bad stuff happened to them because they were in the house longer and things trickled down to them. And so when they said, "Hey, good news, we'd like a book to be written about the family," a lot of the brothers said, "Well, if it's what you want, then I'm okay with it." And then finally, Mimi was ready. The mother was ready. She had been against the idea for many years, but now she was ready. And I think that's because there was encouraging scientific advances that were made in recent years that were connected to researchers who studied the family. So she felt like there was validation for her, that it wasn't her fault, that it was genetics, not her.
Mm-hmm. To be able to have that kind of confidence to sit there and say, "Wait a second, there was something else going on. It wasn't me." Because I think that for a long time, she took the blame. She was blamed. She was blamed of what was going on. You weren't raising your family correctly or whatever. But is it hard to be that compassionate? Like when you're sitting, like it's hard. Let's say, were these interviews happening in person, over the phone? How was that all going down? I think
for some reason it hit mute. I took maybe 8 trips out to Colorado, and I tried to be one-on-one with everybody more than once, and with the sisters several times. But in between, I would certainly get on the phone for long phone calls as well. I think phone calls can be I don't know if Zoom works as well, but I think phone calls work very, very well for intimate conversations. Laura Hillenbrand, that's all she does, right? Because she doesn't leave the house. Right. So it's very, particularly when you're talking with people about their memories and about their lives, they can sort of wander in their minds and talk about this and that if they're comfortable enough. And so being on the phone might be a comfortable space for them. So I'm not snobby about how best to be in touch, but I certainly wanted to get out there and hang out. I mean, most of nonfiction writing, as some of the leading people say, is about hanging out and being around when things happen. I managed to be out there around the time of Mimi's memorial service and hung out with the whole family at the house, and that winds up in the book. Like, certain things just make it into the book.
Thinking too, when you think about the phone, is if we're sitting having a conversation like this and you nod your head like this, or you do something, it may trigger what the other person's going to tell you of like, "Wait a second, that really shocked him. So let me not go there. Let me do it a different way." Or I'm tantalizing him with what I'm saying here. Let me keep going. Whereas the phone, it's just the voice having the conversation. And I do think that the Zoom and the seeing somebody, it enhances a lot of experience. But at the same time, I think for other experiences, it could hinder, because you might stop talking just because you see the person's not paying attention, or he stopped taking notes. Am I not saying something that matters to him at this point? And I think it's very interesting to think about. You're just doing the voice and talking to each other.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And in fact, when I am face to face with people in interviews, I try to stay very still. Mm-hmm. And I kind of default to a look on my face. It's kind of like this, like I'm trying to figure out what you're saying. As opposed, which actually goes back to Michelle's question about staying impartial, because I feel like that's a good impartial stance, as opposed to, "Oh, you poor baby, that must have been terrible. Give me a hug. We're gonna, don't worry, I'm gonna tell your story, and we're gonna show the world together what you went through. And I'm on your side here," which is a very different stance. I'm much more like, I'm determined to figure out, to understand where you're coming from here, but in a grown-up kind of way.
Well, it's like a more tell me more. Like, tell me more.
Tell me more.
Tell me more. Bring me more to the story, because I hear what you're saying, but tell me some more about it. And then as a result, it's encouraging people to talk more, because it's just, okay, I just want to hear the story. The more you tell me, the more I can tell your story. And that's what I felt like. There's so much on these pages, and I'm wondering that, like, what wasn't on the pages as well, because you do such a good job of bringing everybody to light. And it's detailed stories about each of the living family members. Did it ever surprise you how much cooperation you were getting? Because I would be surprised, I feel like, every day.
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple of brothers who it took a while to book time with them because they just, they weren't as ready to drop everything. But then sure enough, once I was sitting there across the table or hanging out at the house of some of them, or walking around around Colorado Springs with Michael, then it suddenly became, we're just guys hanging out. We're just talking about, what's happening. So I think the one advantage of a book where the events take place a long time ago is that, in a way, some of these folks have been rehearsing what they would say to someone like me for years, even without thinking about it, because it was extraordinary what they went through. And while they may have been resisting it, they have their own take, and they have their own thing that they want to get across. So they're ready to get that across. Only one of the brothers was more quiet and wasn't ready to unfurl his take on the situation. That was Mark Galvin, he's not mentally ill. Really nice guy, terrific person. I like him a lot. He just wasn't telling stories about the family in that way.
Was he the one that was on the Oprah episode with you? Who from the family was there? Was it Mark?
There was Richard and Mark, I think, were both on there.
Okay, great. That was a terrific episode. If anybody hasn't watched that and you have Apple TV and you can go back, really wonderful way to get to meet the family as well. And I think that happened on a couple of occasions, even when you were on book tour. And I just love that because their enthusiasm for the book just mattered so much. I'm going to bring on Lisa because Lisa's got a good question, and you've actually met Lisa somewhere along the way before. Let's see this. There you go. Hi, Lisa.
Hi. Thanks, Carol. Hi, Bob. I want to thank
Hello.
you. It's great to see you again. And I want to thank you again. You joined our book club in September in Stone Harbor via Zoom. And our members are still talking about it.
Oh,
Fantastic
that's wonderful.
book. Yeah.
Thanks. I hope I imagine I've repeated some things. So,
actually, I've learned a lot of new things during
that's
this.
Great.
Anyways, thank you. It was great, especially since we were all kind of flying by the seat of our pants back then. My question for you is, first of all, I loved the book. And I actually read it and listened to it on audio a second time because there's so much detail and so much science in it that I just wanted to learn more. Have you been able to remain in contact with the siblings you interviewed? And has there been any new research or patient care that has come out since you wrote the book?
Well, you may remember from the book that Matthew was one of the sick brothers who had managed to live independently for many decades, that he was compliant with his medication, and he may be a crusty, grumpy guy who occasionally speaks in fantastical ways and has delusions, but he could drive a car and volunteer at a soup kitchen and had friends and did favors for people and was living his life. But at around the time the book was published, his health started breaking down in various ways. And I think there was an effort to have him change medications because the clozapine was taking its toll in terms of health effects. And the change in medication was a tragic choice, and he ended up in the hospital. And because it was COVID and it was an ER, and the ER people weren't very savvy about mental illness, there was a whole red tape issue. And Lindsay and other family members are on the phone with doctors trying to get help. And so it was a real mess for him last spring. And then eventually he got out of the hospital, though, into a rehab. And I believe now he is he's moved to assisted living and is actually doing fine. And is even playing music or teaching music to other people at the assisted living place. He would like to live independently again, but I think the people around him are convinced that that's probably not possible. So he's in decline physically, probably as a result of the long-term use of the medications. Lindsay has doubled down on her advocacy efforts. She really wants to be a resource for family members of people who are mentally ill and to help them with the challenges that she's faced as a caregiver as well. She's joined the boards of a couple organizations, and so the book has kind of fired her up in that way and made her feel
that's
good.
great.
Margaret has gotten kind of doubled down on her artwork, and also, she always focused on the idea of the book as a book about how to transcend trauma and find a way through difficulties in your childhood. And so she's counseling people one-on-one about that, and also doing a lot of art. And so the book felt like a almost like a checked box on her list. Like that story is told.
I can
now.
see that.
So she feels like it's like a new chapter for her. She's feeling good that way. And the other folks, aside from the occasional, pats on the back on social media, I haven't really talked to much. And I think COVID is an issue there, because I certainly would have been back to Colorado since the book was published, but I don't think I'm going back there till the fall. And then I want to see everybody, including Nancy Gary, the wealthy family that helped the Galvins. Sam died sometime last year. He was in his 90s, but Nancy is 10 years younger. She's in her 80s and still around. I'd like to see her as well.
Isn't it amazing, like what we think about the toll of COVID in so many ways? So we know what the toll was on our lives. I mean, the fact that you've launched the hardcover and the paperback, both of which folks hit the New York Times list for multiple weeks, in spite of the fact that Bob was not able to go out on the road promoting this book. He was doing all kinds of other things. And you didn't get those opportunities to go into the bookstores and possibly bring people from the family there. And it's almost like it's like another time for the book, for, going out and having those kinds of conversations. And I think, we thought about COVID and what it was, what the reaction was for all of us who felt like, we have somewhat normal lives, but still what it was like to not be able to leave the house and wear a mask and do all these kinds of things. And you can just imagine what it was like with somebody with mental illness in that same kind of a situation. This is, a different way of getting help.
Yeah, I've circulated with a lot of, over Zoom, obviously, with a lot of mental health providers and caregivers and clinicians. And they, COVID's tough for the mentally ill, because even the people who are well situated, they rely on routines like the part-time job they have or the place where they're volunteering.
Right.
And if that falls apart, then that's one domino that sets off other dominoes. And it's hard, really. It's been hard for the mentally ill.
Yeah. Thank you, Lisa. Really good questions.
Great to see you again, Bob.
Thank you, Lisa.
I've heard from readers that are members of families who have schizophrenics, and they're found your storytelling to be very interesting. Mary Jane is one who wrote, and she noted that she very much enjoyed the book. We have a son with schizophrenia and could very much relate. The one thing I noticed missing was research on parental acceptance of children's disabilities and issues. Robert comments that Mimi, the mom, seems to have an unrealistic or lack of perception about her children's illness, but this is true of most parents, regardless of a disability. It seems that mentioning the research besides this, even a short paragraph, would help many readers deal with this complex issue. Denial is a large part of it, as is guilt, anger, depression, anxiety, and fear. Mimi was not unique in her emotional approaches or responses, and I'm wondering why he didn't look at this research and tie it in overall. Was this something that you explored?
That's a really wonderful question. A wonderful question. I think, Mimi exists as sort of a model of, I don't mean a good model. I mean a case study of how a parent reacts to the situation. And yes, there's lots of denial and shame. And then but then at some point she turns a corner and she becomes the chief caregiver, the one who's running around and demanding service from various mental health providers and understanding what all the drugs are and taking care, looking after everyone. And so she's a mixed bag. And I would say that's true of, as the questioner said, that's true of so many people. I did not want her to be a monster in the book. I think there are too many novels and too many nonfiction books that kind of blame everything on mom. And I feel as if she's a more complicated figure than that. She definitely made mistakes, but she had no support. No, all of society was sort of against mothers. They thought that mothers were the cause of mental illness at the time. So she had very few options. But as to the specific question, I had I had a conversation with a woman who provides early intervention services for people who have maybe had their first psychotic break, and so they're just sort of figuring out whether how much medicine they should have versus how much therapy, how to prevent future psychotic breaks. And most of her work involves working with the family to adjust to this new reality, to go through that process, to get past the denial and the shame. She didn't use the words denial and shame, though. She talked about it almost as a grieving process, like helping parents grieve for what might have been, or for the image they had in their mind of the future for their child, and understand that there's a new baseline now to work from. And that winds up being a tremendous amount of her work. There's a lot to be. The short answer to your questioner is she's absolutely right. There's a lot more to be said on this subject.
Yeah, I know it's interesting because there's a story that if you have something that happens with your child and your child is young, it's the first time your heart breaks, and everybody's going to have it at some point along the way. Yours is just a little bit earlier. And everybody goes into dreams with their child. I mean, the baby's there and it's like, they're going to be this, this, and this. And then all of a sudden it doesn't kind of go that way. And when you have a parent where there's a child where the break happens really super early, it's going to happen for everybody somewhere along the way, that something will disappoint, that it won't go exactly the way. But this is a very blatant one. This is very much in your face. And I think it makes it harder in a lot of ways, but then it also is like, okay, what's our path forward going to be? You know,
Yep.
where are we going to go from here? So
Mimi fascinated me because while she clearly was very active in keeping the family together and in getting help for her sons, in conversation, she really was living in the past. She was focused on that before picture, in the before and after. She would sit and she would talk about things that happened in the 1950s when the kids were well and the family had high social status. She would talk about them as if they happened just yesterday. You know, and she would say, oh yes, we were a model family, and Donald used to be a football star, or whatever it is she would say about the successes of the family. She clung to that before picture in her mind.
And the picture that we see on the cover of the book, she
Yeah.
clung to exactly the way they looked. Everybody's wearing uniforms. Everybody looks, this certain way. Tragedies have the power to shape families and bring them closer together or pull them apart. And how is it that they are shaped by their own tragedies? Like it's brought them together in so many ways. Are they pulled apart at this point, or is everybody pretty much on the same page?
Well, there's an exaggerated version of what happens in a lot of families, which is that there's one child who's more on it than the others in terms of family stuff, and that's Lindsay. She's the one who's a point person for the sick brothers who are still alive, and who is really kind of the family leader. And she knows very full well that she is both beloved and resented for that. That and then she is resentful also of the people in her family. And I, there's a version of that in my family. There's a version of that in a lot of people's families. Like there's an imbalance. Somebody ends up doing more, and other people end up doing less. And living far away becomes a luxury, but then you feel disconnected from your family, so you feel a little abandoned too. So I'm interested in those subtleties. I was amazed that they're a family at all, to be honest, and I was wondering how that happened. And so my job, I think, in telling the story was to talk about the new ways they found to relate to their family. I mean, Margaret, it should be said, is really in a period where she's created a lot of distance. You see glimmers of it at the end of the book, but she's decided not to be in regular touch with basically anyone. That I think that if something major happens, she'd be in touch, but she is not interested in being day to day with her family for the time being. And she talks about her current family, her nuclear family. She's very much involved in.
But she also got to escape. She was, out of the loop there for a while, and in some formative years was living a very different life. So she's like, getting yanked back into this. I could even see it in the Oprah interview. She was talking about her artwork. She was talking about this. There was definitely a disconnect with what was going on. I'm here, but this is like, I'm here tonight, but I'm not here 365. I'm not here every day. I've moved on in my head. And you could just feel that. And you could see also why, because she was trying to hold a little guard up around herself. So
yeah, absolutely.
I think I'm going to bring on Debbie. Debbie's got a couple of really good questions. So Debbie, joining us now. Kind of fun. People pop on. There you go. Hi, Debbie.
Hi there.
And I want to say, first of all, I learned so much from this book, and I really appreciated that. And my questions are really more about the science and the medical part of it. So first of all, what, if any, were the reactions of the facilities that treated the Galvin boys to your research and your book?
There's the folks at Pueblo freely acknowledged that that earlier eras at the state hospital in Pueblo, Colorado, were had serious problems. So I think they were ready for a book that took kind of a dim view of what life was like there in the late 60s or early 70s. It was a period where there was probably an over-reliance on medication, where they were pumping people full of Thorazine. And so they knew that, and they even said that. So I wasn't worried too much about that. But there are also stories of great valor too, that Peter Galvin's doctor at the state hospital in Pueblo, he battles to get him the right housing situation and helps him, helps come up with a solution that's workable for him. And so I wasn't too worried about their reaction to it. The researchers all are very pleased that the book is accurate. And I'm very thrilled to say that and I worked really hard to run sections of the book by experts to make sure that I wasn't making stupid mistakes, but it paid off because people in the research community and in the treatment community all say that there are no red flags in the book. There are no moments where they say, wait a minute, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. So I'm relieved about that.
Thanks. When you talk about those scientists, and you in your book talked about the genetic mutations and some of the new ones they found, and so that that might be responsible for schizophrenia. How is the treatment for these individuals suffering from diseases, from schizophrenia and other diseases on the spectrum, changed or improved?
The treatment pharmaceutically is sadly not terribly different, except there's more nuance probably in the way that the prescriptions happen, the way that the medications are dispensed. They aren't just, people don't get as much of it maybe, or they start small. But there's been no major innovation, like no new class of drug has really changed the game for schizophrenia, which was a huge surprise for me.
Mhm.
I thought we lived in the age of biochemistry where there was a pill for every condition, but the pills for schizophrenia are the same pills that the Galvins took in 1970. And that's really stunning. But there's a lot that's changed. There's the early intervention that I mentioned briefly earlier is something that really happens now in a way that never happened before. A child like Donald Galvin, smashing all the dishes in the kitchen when he's 16 years old, he would probably get support now in a way that never would have happened back then. And that means that the huge psychotic break that Donald had when he was 25, where he almost killed himself and his wife, like that may never have happened if he had gotten help back in his teens. He would have he might still have schizophrenia, but he would have a much more functional life with perhaps, a lot less, violence and friction. So that emphasis on early intervention, if you're lucky enough to have good healthcare in this country, is very, very different. And then the other big difference is family support. I mean, when the Galvin boys were sick, the families were often considered to be the enemy of progress. One of the priorities was to remove the person from their family situation because at best, they weren't helping, and at worst, they were causing the problem. Whereas now, the families are a key to support, and that they know that the more support a schizophrenia sufferer has, the better shot they have at not declining the way that they so significantly can. So those are, that's cause for optimism.
Yeah.
I wish I could say there's more on the genetic front, but as I outline in the book, they found one variant that increases the probability of schizophrenia, and then they found another, and then they found another. They found like over 130, and each of them increased the probability by such a little amount that it's basically trivial. And so there is no one genetic mutation that they can zap with a drug and solve this problem. Not yet, anyway.
Yeah. Do you think that the reason that you were saying that the drugs are pretty similar is that the pharmaceutical, it's mainly a commercial problem, is that the pharmaceutical companies think that they can't make money on these drugs? Or it's not worth the time and development money?
Yeah, I feel like there's a bunch of reasons. One is that they're already making money. Everybody has a version of Thorazine or clozapine, and they're making money for the company. So it's like, where's the fire, right? Why innovate if we're doing okay? And those drugs are managing the symptoms of patients. They aren't curing anybody, but they're managing the symptoms. So it's not like there's an emergency there. But the other issues are probably more persuasive. But first of all, you really have to test these medicines on humans. You can't. Mice or rats don't get schizophrenia. So and so that's really risky and really expensive. So
Yeah.
it's a huge demanding thing to do. And then the other issue is that while the National Alliance on Mental Illness does wonderful things and can support people in ways that they otherwise wouldn't be supported, they aren't necessarily as powerful an advocacy group as the National Cancer Society, American Cancer Society, or something like that. So that this population isn't getting a lot of political support for drug innovation, and that to me, that's a big deal.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions, Debbie. Over the years, the past year, there have been so many special stories that you've heard from readers. Like, I take it, Lisa's is not the only book club that you've been to. What are some of the things that you've heard from people? I mean, have people who have families with people with schizophrenia reached out to you? What are some seminal moments that have happened for you as an author as this year has gone on?
Some of the more fun questions from readers have to do with the sisters and have to do with Mimi, with the mother. Just long, intense conversations about Mimi, where half the people on the Zoom are convinced that she was a terrible mother and that she should never have had 12 children to begin with, and the other half are really on her side and say, look at what she was dealing with, and she was so victimized, and her husband was so aloof, and she was left holding the bag, and she's really the hero of the book. So, is Mimi a hero or villain? Is a conversation I never get tired of having.
Mhm.
And then the question of the sisters, not who's right and who's wrong, but how they each represent a different approach to what are basically very similar situations. They each had similar trauma, and they each dealt with it in a different way. One decided to run back to the family and really do it all, and probably at the expense of some of her, it probably caused damage to some of her relationships because she was working so hard to tend to her brothers. And then the other one set up boundaries in a way that created a tremendous amount of resentment from the rest of the family. So you see the mixed bag with both of them. And I've talked with readers where they've said, some days I feel like I'm more like Lindsay, and other days I feel like I'm more like Margaret. Like, I just have different approaches or different feelings about my family on different days of the week. And I thought that was a unique opportunity with this book to present two people like that, hopefully in a non-judgmental way, where I'm not like taking a side, but where I'm showing two different ways of being. I thought that was pretty exciting.
Yeah.
Talking to Oprah was great. She's a wonderful interviewer. I really, this is a dumb complaint in the age of COVID, where there's been so much sadness and tragedy, but it would have been nice to meet her personally. But still, she really, I got to see firsthand just what a wonderful interviewer she is, just how she makes the strangest of interactions just feel completely normal and pleasant. She's really terrific.
And she asks the right questions. She asks really the right questions and keeps it moving. And that she has gotten these questions in advance. She doesn't know what your answers are
Yeah.
going to be, but the whole thing is directed in this way that is artful. It's completely artful when you sit and watch one of her interviews. So
Yeah, I mean, there were some questions she asked me that clearly were supplied to her, but that still it was the right time to ask them and the right way to ask them, and it all seemed very organic. It was really, really cool.
yeah. So someday you'll be meeting Oprah. Someday we'll meet too. We'll just do this in person at some point. What may have to wait till the next book, but we'll see. So let's go to audience questions. Audison, I'm going to have you be voice of God. Do you have some audience questions? And anyone, if you want to put a question down in the Q&A, this is your moment.
Yes, there are audience questions, and I'll try to get as many as I can.
Could do a lightning round.
Yeah, maybe we should. Jill asks a great question. Do you tape your interviews, take notes, or do you write notes after you speak with people?
I've come full circle on taping because I was a reporter back in the 1990s before the technology was what it was now. And so, and I was a snob about it. You know, journalists would say, you should really write everything down in a notebook because that helps focus your mind. You write down the important stuff. If you sit there with a tape recorder, everything takes too long and you end up spacing out in the middle of interviews and not asking good questions. Lots of drawbacks to taping at the time. But then taping now is so cheap and so easy, and the technology is so good. You know, you don't have to turn cassettes or save tapes. It's all just, you know, the way that you know it is. It's all digital. So I tape everything now. I mean, I just tape everything now. And to me, it gives me confidence that that I can pick up on little things and go back and follow up on them later, little things that I might not have noticed before.
Yeah, you're making me laugh because if I take notes, I can't read my own handwriting. So I can sit there and take all the notes in the world. And many times if we're doing I'm watching a publisher doing a presentation with an author, I'll take notes and then later on I have to rewatch the interview to see what did I write down there? I can't even read my writing, especially if you're involved in a story.
And you can never seem to write as fast as people talk.
Right.
I know that there are like different scripts that some journalists use, but it's got to be distracting to do that while talking with someone.
Yeah.
Margaret,
And then sometimes things are so sensitive and the questions are so very sensitive that you really want a taped record of the answer, because you don't want to get it wrong, because then you really could hurt somebody if you don't present it accurately.
Oh yeah. Margaret asks, can you tell us something about the third generation? If the story is about genetics, do Mimi's grandchildren show signs of mental disorders? And how are they doing?
So far, so good with the grandchildren. It seems to be following the general trajectory with schizophrenia, which is that it doesn't seem to go straight from parent to child. It kind of bounces around in unpredictable ways. And then it's possible that with this family, it was really about a particular a genetic variant that happened when Don and Mimi had kids, as opposed to it wasn't some smoking gun problem that one of them kept passing on through the family generations. That's the theory anyway. But it's good news so far.
Hopefully. Susan asks, do you think that your book helped to make more awareness of this disorder?
I certainly hope so. I really feel like we've made great strides with so many mental health conditions and brain conditions like autism and depression and anxiety and bipolar disorder. Those are all things that when I was a little kid, we never really talked about. And now we all talk about those things all the time. And I like to think schizophrenia is on that track. And I hope the book is part of that. And I really, you know, I want to keep beating the drum for the book for that reason alone, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you answered this a bit with Debbie, but Gail asks if there's been any improvement or any more medical research put into the Galvin's condition since the book was published.
The folks who found a genetic mutation that seemed like the family had, they've continued to study other families in Dr. DeLisi's collection, other multiplex families, and they've come up with other results, and they're about to publish it. It's sort of confirming the idea that every family seems to have something, but not every family has the same thing. But the thing about all these variants is they all seem tied to brain function in some way, and so it's kind of giving us giving us a place to shine the flashlight in the darkness now. We can look at that at different elements of brain function and see how can we make the brain more resilient in this area so that it can develop in a more healthy way despite these genetic issues that happen. So it's slowly, it's going to be slow going, but it's encouraging.
So more about the book, I suppose. Patty Joe asked if you were ever scared when talking with the brothers who had schizophrenia.
I wasn't. I was worried about it at the beginning before I met them, because I didn't want the book to be a monster movie. I didn't want it to be like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where suddenly somebody gets sick and they become the enemy. I also didn't want to write a book that would say, and then Peter got sick, and that'd be the last you'd ever hear from Peter again. But then, of course, very quickly, as soon as I went out to Colorado for the first time, I saw that these guys weren't living in maximum security, straitjacket kind of situations. Like they were, Donald's in assisted living where he might be the only person with mental illness. Everybody else may have Alzheimer's or other aging diseases. And he gets his mental health care from providers off-site. So he's just a guy living in assisted living in his 70s, a little younger than everybody else there, but that's because he's got his thing. And he's a very tranquil presence. And Peter's more frail and more impaired because he's the one who gets electroshock treatments regularly. So he has cognition issues. He doesn't remember too much, but he loves everybody who comes into contact with him. And he remembers everybody in his family and is very attached to his family. And so he's in a different assisted living place. And like, it's like visiting a very, someone who's obviously has a disability, but is a person with a real personality. And then Matthew is, he's crusty and grumpy and grouchy and funny. And he dresses kind of like a biker. He looks a little like Hagrid. But then of course he kind of, he grumbles and grouches about things. And then in the same breath, he talks about how grateful he is that his family's helping him out. So he's his own person too. These weren't, I think of course I was meeting these guys not when they were 25, but when they were in their 70s. So you get, perhaps there might've been a different level of uncertainty about or volatility back then.
Yeah, I think we're going to forget how they spanned the baby boom. Like there's a big age gap between these children. I mean, there is the 12 years, and it's the both times of the baby boom, and you realize they are older now. Like we read them and we're thinking of them as children, but these are people that are mature and elderly almost at this point.
It's true. Yeah, half of them were like children of the 50s, or most of them were children of the 50s, and then the tail end were children of the 60s. It was 1945 to 1965. And it's 20 years, which means there was a lot for me to piece together, because I would be asking questions, and in general, only one or two people would really know the answers to the questions, because they took place at a time when only they were the ones in the house who would remember, or the other people had left the house already, or the other people hadn't been born yet.
Question, did you have trouble keeping straight who everybody was? I mean, I have friends that there were 9 children in the family. There were moments that you'd be getting together and you're like, okay, this one, like you'd be naming their names. Was there ever that moment, or could you see everybody right away?
It took a while, and I had a chart next to my computer. And that chart was the beginning of the solution I had to have the cast of characters at the top of every chapter. I realized, hey, this is helping me. This would help readers too. So, and then I came up with the idea of bold-facing whoever would be featured in that chapter, almost like a baseball program. Like you would know who's up at bat at the beginning of each chapter. And I felt like that was I really heaved a sigh of relief when I came up with that, because I thought that could be helpful to people.
Susan asked a question. How did you decide that the 2 sisters would be more of the story and kind of the focus rather than the brothers?
Very early on, I realized that the only way to technically accomplish a book with 12 kids and 2 parents and 2 teams of researchers with so many names was that certain people were going to have to be foregrounded, and certain people would have to be like satellites who would be in orbit, you would occasionally visit with them, but the reader would kind of know in their bones that as soon as they had finished spending a little time with this person, you were going to go back to the main people. That would be the only way that a reader would be able to sort of hold it in their head. And so I knew that Mimi would be one, the mother, and I knew that the sisters would be two more. And then in the writing and revising, I think I found, in my opinion, I think Donald, the oldest mentally ill son, winds up being one of those as well, because there's so much material in him from early in his life and his descent into mental illness. And so they become sort of your kind of mainstays who you kind of know you're going to come back to. And then someone like John or Richard, you know, you'll have quick visits with. But I wanted it to be an ensemble, a group portrait and an ensemble book. I wanted to have like a whole chapter of Michael Galvin going to that commune and have coming up with a whole new way of thinking about his family. I felt like that's what make a big sprawling book like that is what makes these big epic books, these multi-generational family sagas so much fun, you know, so rich and rewarding.
And it's interesting what you said earlier about Peter, I think it was, that was it difficult to parse out some information that people were telling you at any time? Did that have a factor to play in that?
Yeah, and I wasn't relying on any of the three surviving mentally ill sons for their memories. I really was just interviewing them to get a flavor of what it was like to be around them and what it was like for their family members to see them. So I wasn't asking them about names and dates or anything like that. But the other people, yeah, that sometimes they would remember things well and sometimes they wouldn't. I mean, one thing readers might realize, have realized already, is that there are very few scenes like that Thanksgiving scene in the book, you know, because they are very hard to reliably piece together. The other scenes are often based on you know, medical documents put it together, or you know, present, you know, day records, or perhaps it's a vivid moment between that Lindsay and them had with her mother, an interaction with her that she really remembers well. But in general, the bigger moments are harder to piece together.
Jerry asked, how is schizophrenia diagnosed and how has that changed over the years?
It's always been a moving target. It's always been a classification more than an actual disease. Like, it is not like COVID-19 or like breast cancer. It is a word that diagnosticians give to a group of symptoms and because it's useful for them to come up with treatment plans for people who they give that word to. But those symptoms change. The definition of the disease changes each time the DSM manual changes. And so they look for things, though, like in general, a disassociating from reality, a detachment from your own thoughts and motivations. So you have younger people either hearing voices or perhaps becoming somewhat catatonic and zoning out, or being impulsive and doing things that they don't understand what their motivations are, sort of becoming a stranger to themselves. One hallmark of it is loose associations when you're thinking. You'd say, like, I read a book today and it was just, you know, and it was just like a snowstorm underwater, you know, or whatever, you know, like just where people aren't really connecting ideas in a traditional way. It might be a hallmark of it. But I think one example that the Galvins give readers is how the symptoms are different with in every case. It's just not a cookie cutter condition. I mean, Peter is kind of manic and cycles in and out of jails because he goes in and out of, you know, drug use and stuff like that. Whereas Donald was hyper religious and delusional, and Joseph was self-aware about it. He had hallucinations. He saw things, but he also knew that they were hallucinations. He was the only self-aware one of the brothers. Everybody's a little different in the way they present it.
Patricia asks, well, I'll read this. Hi, I'm a psychiatrist and loved your book. Great overview of how research and theories about psychotic orders have evolved over the years. Also loved looking at this from a family therapy perspective. And the question is, did you feel the need to make some sort of disclaimer in the book, such as the fact that schizophrenic people murdering others or being extremely violent can be rare? And yeah, did you have any concern around the perpetuating that kind of stigma?
I did have a concern about that. I didn't want the takeaway of the book to be the murder suicide or in the violent activities of the brothers being typical. And I was also very worried about Jim Galvin, who sexually abused his sisters. I didn't want to suggest in any way that schizophrenia causes pedophilia, because there's absolutely no data to suggest that. And I actually came out explicitly in the book in 2 different places to make it clear that I wasn't trying to say that. My solution with the violence was to try to show the whole arc of the lives of people like Donald, who, even though he tried to harm his wife and himself when he was 25, ended up living decades later and being a somewhat docile, congenial guy, for the rest of his life. That that no one ends up in a home for the criminally insane with a straitjacket, foaming at the mouth or anything like that. I think things kind of change. There's the whole arc of their lives. But certainly in discussing the book, I'm more explicit. And I actually wrote something, I wrote a series of pieces that came out with the paperback, and one of them was specifically about the issue of violence, where I say what everybody else says, which is that you're 10 times more likely to be a victim of violence if you're mentally ill than to be a perpetrator of violence.
Interesting.
There's this great message from Penny, who says, I just want to compliment you on your impressive research. I grew up on the Air Force Academy and went to both junior high and high school with the Galvins. And your descriptions of the AFA and Woodman Valley were spot on. I shared many of the experiences the boys went through at Air Academy High. My family has a picture on the same steps at Arnold Hall, and I was at the hockey game in 1972 when Richard scored the winning goal. So well written and researched. Thank you.
That's great. I did talk to a lot of friends and neighbors and people who grew up with the Galvins, and I was able to ask them questions about what it was like to grow up in that area, and what the academy was like back then, and what the town was like, and so it wasn't just the family I was learning from. So I'm really pleased to hear that that it's in tune with what you remember.
Mm-hmm.
The Air Force Academy is a beautiful place. Those modern buildings are really amazing, and I did a little double take when I first saw those steps in the main hall there, where that photograph was taken, and realized, oh, that's where I am. I see now. I see where they took the picture.
Amazing.
And we do have to cut this short, but I have a question, if that's all right, which is sometimes when you embark on a big project, like a book or something, it can seem like you're going out to sea and then you're lost out there. And I'm curious what a project like this, how you interact with that same feeling. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I can answer that 2 ways. The first is that I had, in the beginning, when I first met the family, I kind of came up in my mind with like 2 or 3 or 4 big deal breakers where I thought, no way. And one was, the family won't cooperate. Someone in the family will stand up and put a stop to this. There's no way that they'll all want to do it. But then sure enough, they all wanted to do it. And the other would be, the doctors who treated this family, their ideas they're going to be a bunch of quacks, and they're not going to be presenting a really mainstream or interesting view of schizophrenia. The whole thing is going to be kind of fringy and weird. Mm-hmm. Nope, they're right there in the mix. They're influential people, and the Galvins actually had a link to it. And then I was worried the book is going to be read as a book about the violence of the mentally ill. I'm gonna write a book about how the mentally ill are all pedophiles. Then I found a way to try to tell a story that was different from that story. So one by one, all those fell by the wayside. But the other thing I do is I come at it a different way. I have with the only 2 books I've written, which is I try to come up with an idea in my head that I feel is kind of outcome proof, which is to say, even if the book is published and comes and goes and people forget about it a month or 2 later, I still will think that it was worth it. I still will think that it will it was worth trying, worth doing, and that I didn't bankrupt my family or send us all to the poorhouse at the same time. so that I kind of, that way I'm able to sleep at night and think, well, it would be wonderful if this book were an Oprah book, but at the same time, even if it isn't, I feel as if what I'm doing is really worthwhile. And so once I hit that spot, I'm ready to roll. All I want is to get started on it. And so I really started to get excited about the book, maybe 6 months after I first talked to the sisters.
And I think that leads right to what a lot of people have been asking, which is, can you tell us anything about what you're working on next?
Take my question.
Stole it from me.
I'd like to continue writing about families, perhaps not about mental illness, but about family dynamics in different ways, estrangements and or other things related to families. I do write a lot about criminal justice and crime, and so I'm curious. There's certain issues that interest me, like life without parole for minors, how that seems to be something that the Supreme Court is poised to reinforce and continue to perpetuate. And so perhaps there'd be a book there. I'm working on a story for the New York Times Magazine that's exciting and fun. Probably not a book, but it's enjoyable. The books are big things that take a long time for me to ramp up. I kind of have a very particular target. My agent said the other night, he said that you have kind of a small target size, where someone else could be like, I'm gonna write about Donald Trump, or I'm gonna write about this thing that's in the news, where my target size is a little smaller. So I've got to be choosy.
Here's the question too. When you write, how did you work with your editor? Was he doing the give and take along the way? Were you feeding him chapters, or was the whole thing done and then he takes a look at it? How did that interaction work?
My editor was Christine Popolo. She's a genius. She's wonderful. We had a lot of lunches where I would sort of talk through how things were going. And so she had a sense of what was coming, but I don't think she really read anything until I handed her a full manuscript. And then she took a while, like 6 weeks or more, to really read through and come up with notes about it. And she was instrumental in helping me tame all of those science chapters and make them really useful in terms of telling the Galvin family story. I think one problem, one pitfall in nonfiction writing is that you often get so excited about your research that you want to include everything you ever learned about something in the book, and it often leads to red herrings or detours. And so I really wanted to, with Chris's help, I really went to work on those chapters and trim them down so that they would really just be chapters that gave you the appropriate context and raised the stakes for the Galvin family story, that it wasn't like reading a textbook or getting your homework, doing homework about schizophrenia. That she was really, really helpful with that. And with everything else too. She was able to tell me when there wasn't quite enough on one character, that they needed one thing about this or that, or when things were dragging on with another character. And she read it as a reader too. So she would say, oh yes, in this moment, that moment where you wanted people to have chills, I definitely had chills there. So she was like the first focus group for it too.
I'm laughing though, lunch. Used to go to lunch with the editor and sit down and talk. And I'm wondering what we're going to do going forward with everybody, these far-flung places. There are all those places. Our office was a block away from Penguin Random House. And you'd go out to lunch, and I'm thinking like Mollyvos, Trattoria del Arte, what are these places doing? Because those used to be filled, like every table would be different editors and different people from the publishing community. And now
we were at Mollyvos. We were at Mollyvos a lot.
The dips at the beginning and things like that. It's just those moments that to get back to that point, when will we get back to that point, and how's it going to end up happening again? People have moved, they've been far flung at this point. What's going to end up happening? So, well, we all look forward to seeing what you do next. You've got a big fan club. Believe me, you've got a big fan club of our readers. And I thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was so wonderful for us to be able to take a year later, what's ended up happening, and tell us the story. And you've just been so open on everything you've shared with us. We really feel like we're all part of this book.
Oh, that's so kind of you, Carol. Thank you so much. I'm just, I've been overwhelmed for the whole year about the way it's been received, how it's connected with folks, and particularly I'm very moved that I've heard from a lot of people who are family members in families that have been touched by mental illness, and that they feel that the book does some justice to that experience, and that is that's really gratifying and also relieving, but also I feel as if like it really was worthwhile, the many years it took to make the book. So thank you.
So totally worth it. And we look forward to seeing what you do next. Make sure you let us know. We're ready. Even if
Will
it's
do.
Times Magazine, just let me know. Make sure to read it. My husband always steals it to do the crossword puzzle. And I don't get it back. So you're gonna have to tell me what week the piece runs, and then I'll tell our readers. Okay. Thank you so much. I
Thank
wish
you.
you all the very, very best.
All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
And for our readers, if you want to stay tuned for 1 second, we're going to tell you about a couple other things we've got coming up, including who our next book club guest is going to be. First of all, our next Bookaccino live book event will be on Thursday, June 2nd. Book club event will be done Thursday, June 24th at 8 p.m. Slide is coming up. Our guest will be Julie Clark, and we will be discussing The Last Flight, which is her thriller that came out last year. So many of you read it. So many people embraced this book. I interviewed her also last year. So this will be another, bringing back the story. Sign up for this is going to be available tonight on readinggroupguides.com and bookreporter.com a little bit later this evening. And we will also be making this evening's talk available on YouTube and on our podcast, probably by the beginning of next week. And to stay on top of everything that we're doing, because we sort of do have a lot going on with our Bookaccino live events, contests that are happening on the site or whatever, we encourage you to sign up for our newsletters so that you can make sure you're on top of all the events that we're doing. We thank you for joining us tonight. This was a very special evening for us, especially to go back and introduce some of you to Bob for the first time, and others of you who have already seen the other interview to visit with him again. So thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you when we meet with Julie next month. Good night now.